The summer of 1979 was a leech on Cambridge, Massachusetts, sucking the life from anyone foolish enough to dream. The air reeked of hot asphalt and despair, a sour tang that clung to your skin like sweat. Mark, Joey, and I were trapped in it. Three nobodies grinding through lives that felt like borrowed time. Mark was the golden boy, with his mop of chestnut hair and a laugh that could charm a rattlesnake. But his job at an insurance desk was killing him, his eyes dulled by endless forms under flickering fluorescence. Joey, all sharp angles and nervous energy, hauled boxes in a warehouse, his hands rough as bark, his patience fraying like a worn rope. Me, I was the drifter, a 23-year-old temp job ghost, floating from one paycheck to the next, my existence a blur of smudged time cards and half-remembered bosses. We were broke, restless, and starving for something, anything to break the monotony. The Bahamas were a cruel fantasy. Road trips a luxury we couldn't afford. So we settled on camping. Cheap, raw, and just wild enough to fool us into thinking we could outrun our lives. Harold Parker State Forest was our ticket out. A 3,000-acre beast of pine and oak sprawling an hour north of the city. It was vast enough to swallow our problems whole, far enough to drown out Cambridge's relentless hum. We'd been there once before, a day hike years back, and its trails had stuck with me, twisting like veins through a living, breathing green. 3 nights in early fall sounded like salvation. Before the air turned sharp and the rains drowned the trails, we scraped together what we had. My blue hatchback, a rust-eaten relic that coughed but ran. Mark's dad's ancient 2-man tent, patched and musty but serviceable. Joey's bargain bin pup tent, nabbed from an Army-Navy store with a discount for a torn strap. Sleeping bags, a dented cooler, a fishing rod, tarps for rain, and a creased park map rounded out our kit. We weren't Bear Grylls, just 3 dumb kids chasing a flicker of freedom. The drive up was pure chaos, the good kind. Friday afternoon, the sun a blazing coin in a cloudless sky. We tore out of Cambridge with Going Up Country and Born to be Wild rattling the car's cheap speakers. Mark pounded the dashboard like a drum. Joey hollered lyrics he half knew, and I grinned behind the wheel, each mile peeling away the city's weight like dead skin. By dusk, we hit the forest gravel lot, a lone sedan parked at the far end like a forgotten guest, a few bucks stuffed in an envelope at the self-service kiosk, and we claimed a site near Berry Pond, a flat clearing hugged by towering pines, the ground a soft quilt of needles. 50 yards off, the pond caught the last light, its surface glowing like molten gold. It was raw, untouched, the kind of place that made clocks feel like a bad joke. We hauled gear, muscles aching but spirits high. Mark, the self-proclaimed fire god, knelt by the pit, coaxing flames from newspaper and kindling, the fire's tongues licking the dusk with greedy hunger. Hot dogs speared on whittled sticks hissed over the blaze, their charred aroma weaving into the sharp pine air. Beans simmered in a pot I'd liberated from my mum's basement, bubbling with a metallic tang that promised heartburn but smelled like victory. We sprawled on logs dragged to the fire, eating like we'd never tasted food before. Beers cracked open, cold and crisp, their bite cutting through the smoky haze. The stars punched through the velvet sky. I leaned toward the flames, their heat kissing my cheeks, my shoulders loosening for the first time in months. This, I thought, is what I needed. Saturday woke us with a crisp bite, the forest alive with whispers. We picked a 3-mile trail looping around Berry Pond, boots crunching over gnarled roots and moss-slick stones. Squirrels darted, leaves rustled overhead, and the air tasted clean, like biting into a fresh apple. The trail climbed to an overlook, and the view hit like a fist. Miles of green rippling under a buttery sun. The pond below, a perfect mirror. We sprawled on a granite slab, passing trail mix. Too stunned to talk, Mark broke the silence, joking he'd quit his job to live out here. A forest hermit with a beard to his knees. Joey snorted. You'd last a week before you missed pizza. I laughed, but part of me envied the forest's apathy. It didn't care about rent or deadlines. It just existed. That night, we feasted again. More hot dogs, more beans, more beers. We swapped stories around the fire. Mark's epic dodgeball win in high school. Joey's dumpster dive for a stray cat that scratched him raw. My disastrous date with a girl who thought I was her cousin. The fire snapped, sparks spiraling into the dark like tiny comets, the pond soft lapping a lullaby. By 10 p.m., we were wiped, crawling into our tents. Joey's pup tent hunched nearby, a dark smudge against the pines. I zipped up the two-man, Mark already half asleep, muttering about constellations. I drifted off to the forest pulse, crickets chirping, owls hooting, leaves whispering secrets. Then I woke, and the world was wrong. The cold wasn't just chilly, it was alive. A damp, clammy thing pressing against my skin like invisible hands. My breath hitched, sharp and shallow, fogging in the dark. I groped for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the tense gloom like a blade. The flap hung open, unzipped, sagging like torn flesh. Mark's sleeping bag was empty, his boots gone, but his jacket lay wadded in a corner, abandoned. My watch glowed 4:32 a.m. He's just taking a leak, I told myself, but my gut twisted, heavy as lead. The forest was silent, too silent. No crickets, no wind, just a stillness that felt like it was holding its breath, watching. I counted seconds, waiting for his whistle, his clumsy steps, anything. 1 minute, 2, nothing. My flashlight shook as I swept it over the tent, half hoping he'd pop up, grinning, calling me a paranoid idiot. But the emptiness laughed back. Heart pounding, I crawled to the flap, peering out. The darkness was a wall, swallowing my beam like black water. Mark, I whispered, my voice a frail thread, snuffed out by the night. No answer. I yanked on boots, zipped my jacket, and stepped out, flashlight carving weak arcs. The campsite was a ghost town, fire pit cold, ashes grey, Joey's tent motionless. I circled, calling louder, Mark! The pines loomed, their branches clawing the sky, shadows twitching just beyond my light. My pulse roared, a drumbeat in my ears. He's fine. He's wandered off, right? But doubt sank its teeth deeper with every step. I was about to wake Joey when his tent unzipped, his head poking out, hair a tangled mess. What's going on, man? Mark's gone, I said, voice cracking. Flaps open. He's not here. Joey squinted, rubbing his eyes. Probably pissing in the bushes. Chill. It's been too long. Something's wrong. He groaned, climbing out, tugging on boots. You're such a drama queen. Bet he's back in 5 laughing at you. We split up, circling the site. Flashlight stabbing the dark. I shouted Mark's name, my voice echoing off trees, swallowed by the forest's vastness. It didn't feel alive anymore, not like Saturday's warmth. It felt hungry, like a beast lying in wait. My beam caught glints, dew, a spiderweb, but no Mark. 10 minutes later, we regrouped at the fire pit. Joey's face tighter now, his bravado crumbling. Okay, maybe he's not pissing. He sleepwalks sometimes, Joey said, grasping at straws. Did it as a kid. Once ended up in his backyard, didn't even wake up. Sleepwalking? Here? I pictured Mark stumbling over roots, blind in the dark, and my stomach churned. We gotta find him. We widened the search, sticking together, our beams crossing like dueling swords. The ground sloped down, roots snagging our boots, my socks soaked, hands numb. Fear drove us, raw and relentless. We yelled for Mark, voices hoarse, devoured by the forest's silence. An hour in, Joey froze, his flashlight locked on a bush. What the hell? My beam followed, and my heart sank. Mark's faded blue cap, the one he'd worn all weekend, hung snagged on thorns, its brim frayed like a battle scar. We stared, breath clouding in the cold. "That's his," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Doesn't mean anything," Joey said, but his tone wavered. Could have fallen off. We pushed on, calling louder, desperation creeping in. 50 feet later, we found his socks, one, then the other, tossed aside like shed skin. Then his jeans, crumpled in the dirt, zipper glinting. His t-shirt, caught in a branch, flapping like a ghost. His boxers draped over a stump, obscene in their loneliness. Each piece formed a deliberate path, a trail of breadcrumbs leading deeper into the dark. My mind spun. Why strip? Hypothermia? Drugs? But Mark wasn't a prankster, and we'd polished off the beers Friday. This wasn't him. This wasn't right. "Joey, what if he's hurt?" I said, my flashlight trembling. "He's not hurt," Joey snapped, eyes darting, betraying his fear. "He's somewhere." We followed the trail, the forest tightening around us, branches scraping our jackets like skeletal fingers. The air thickened, heavy with damp earth and a new scent. Sharp, metallic, like old pennies. My beam swept low, catching a glint. I stopped, breath hitching. In a clearing, lit by our flashlights, lay a body, chest up, pale as bone. Blood soaked the ground, a black pool spreading from a clean, straight stump where the head should have been. Time stopped. My mind screamed, "No, no, no." The body matched Mark's height, his build, no tattoos, no scars. His clothes littered the path behind us. It had to be him. But my brain recoiled, insisting it was fake. A mannequin, a prank. The skin glowed bluish white, too smooth. The blood congealed like candle wax. I'd never seen death, and it felt staged, like the forest had painted a nightmare just for us. Joey's flashlight shook, his voice rising, frantic. "Mark, Mark." He paced, refusing to look at the body, shouting into the void. "It's not him. It can't be." "Joey," I said, throat tight. "It's him." "No." He spun, eyes wild, tears catching the light. "It's not. Joey, look at him," I yelled, anger slicing through fear. "His clothes, his build. It's Mark." He froze, hands clutching his head, and sobbed, a raw animal sound that tore at my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were stone. The forest watched, silent, complicit, its shadows curling closer. I stumbled to Joey, gripping his shoulder. "We gotta do something, man. We can't just leave him." He nodded, gasping, and we turned back, half running, half stumbling to camp. The trees seemed to lean in, their shadows twisting, figures, faces, things that flickered and vanished. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed, smacking it against my palm. We reached the car, tires screeching as I floored it toward Middleton, toward the ranger station. Dawn broke, grey and thin, but it felt like a lie. No salvation, just exposure. The ranger station was a squat building, its lights harsh against the morning gloom. Two rangers, bleary at 5:50 a.m., handed us coffee, their faces unreadable. Joey stammered through the story, voice shredded, tears streaking his dirt-smudged cheeks. I filled in gaps, my words hollow, like reciting a script. They asked questions we couldn't answer. Did you hear anything? See anyone? We begged to show them, and one ranger followed, his boots heavy on the trail. When he saw the body, his jaw locked, eyes narrowing. He radioed it in. One body, decapitated, 2 witnesses, and ordered us to wait. His gaze screamed distrust, like we'd butchered our friend for sport. EMTs arrived, then cops, their cruisers' lights flashing silently, eerie in the dawn. They bagged everything, tents, cooler, knives, our clothes, as evidence, stripping the site to bones. They split us up, grilling me by the tents, Joey by the pond. Where were you? What did you hear? Did Mark have enemies? Their questions were bullets, cold and relentless. They thought we did it. I saw it in their flat stares, their clipped tones. Hours later, they drove us to the precinct, not arresting us, just needing a recorded statement. The interrogation room was a grey coffin, the detective's notepad a blade. He asked if I'd fought with Mark, if I was jealous, angry. I snapped. He was my best friend. But he just scribbled, his eyes dead. They let us go, but suspicion clung like damp rot. Forensics cleared us. No blood, no weapon. But the case went cold. No motive, no suspects, and Mark's head never surfaced. The forest had swallowed it, or something worse had claimed it. Joey fled to Oregon, chasing distance, his calls growing rare. I stayed in Cambridge, but I wasn't me anymore. Days bled into nights, my mind trapped in that clearing. The blood, the stump, the silence. I lost jobs, friends, my girlfriend, everyone who couldn't bear the husk I'd become. Booze sharpened the nightmares. Mark walking away, stripping, turning headless when I called. I'd wake screaming, my apartment a cave of shadows, the walls closing in. Years later, therapy and meds dulled the edges, but the forest held tight. I wrote it all down, every detail, hoping to trap it on paper. It helped, barely. I don't camp anymore. Woods, parks, even a backyard tree line. They're all snares, waiting to snap. The old me died out there, beside Mark's body, and whatever took his head is still out there, watching, waiting for me to slip back into the dark. But Harold Parker wasn't done with me. Locals started whispering, stories I hadn't heard in '79, or maybe I'd been too naive to listen. They spoke of a figure in the pines, too tall, too thin, its face a void where eyes should be. Hunters found deer gutted, heads gone, arranged in neat circles like offerings. Hikers heard footsteps that stopped when they turned, felt breaths on their necks in empty clearings. An old-timer at a Middleton diner swore he saw eyes, red, unblinking, in Berry Pond's reflection at midnight. He laughed it off, pouring coffee with shaking hands. But his fear was real. I dug deeper, desperate for answers. Old newspapers, ranger logs, obscure forums, anything. A 1963 report mentioned unexplained remains near the pond. Human, headless, never identified. A 1940s article called The Forest Cursed, linked to loggers who vanished, their tools found but bodies gone. Patterns emerged, sharp and undeniable. Every decade, someone disappears, or parts of them do. Always near Berry Pond, always at night. The map haunted me most. Mark had it last, folded in his pocket. When the cops bagged his jeans, it was missing. I checked the evidence list later. No map. Maybe it fell out, lost in the dirt. Or maybe something took it, like it took his head, like it's taken others. I picture it out there, that thing, clutching the map, its fingers tracing trails, choosing its next guest. I drove by the forest once, years later, testing myself. The sign for Harold Parker loomed, faded but defiant. My hands locked on the wheel, heart pounding like that night. The trees seemed to lean toward the road, whispering, "Come back." I floored it. City lights my lifeline. But in the quiet, I hear the ponds lapping, feel the cold, see the stump, and I wonder if it's done with me, or if it's just waiting, patient as the dark. The forest wasn't just a backdrop. It was a character, alive and malevolent. Berry Pond wasn't just water. It was a mirror for something older, something that didn't reflect right. The pines didn't sway. They leaned, their needles whispering secrets no human should hear. Every step we took that weekend felt like trespassing, like we'd crossed a line drawn long before our births. Mark was the heart of us, the glue. His laugh could cut through any gloom, his optimism a shield against the world's grind. He'd talk about big plans, quitting his job, traveling, living free, while Joey and I nodded, knowing we'd never dare. Joey was the skeptic, all edges and defiance, his wiry frame buzzing with restless energy. He'd scoff at Mark's dreams, call them fairy tales, but his eyes betrayed envy. Me, I was the quiet one, the observer, content to drift in their orbit, my own dreams buried under layers of doubt. Together, we were a tripod, unsteady but balanced, until the forest tipped us over. That first night, as we sat by the fire, I noticed things I didn't mention then. The way the flames seemed to shy away from the pond, their light stopping short of its edge. The way the crickets paused when Mark laughed too loud, like they were listening. Small things, easy to dismiss in the beer-soaked haze, but they lingered, gnawing at the edges of my memory. Saturday's hike felt like a gift, the forest showing its softer side. But even then, there were signs. A crow followed us, hopping from branch to branch, its eyes too human. A patch of ground near the overlook was scorched, though no fire pit marked it. Joey tripped over a root that looked too much like a hand, its knuckles gnarled and pale. We laughed it off, Joey's clumsiness, Mark's crow impression. But unease settled in my gut, a seed waiting to sprout. By Sunday, the forest mask was slipping. The air felt thicker, the colors muted, like the world was holding its breath. We hiked a longer trail, our legs heavy, conversation sparse. Mark was quieter, his jokes fewer, his eyes scanning the trees like he saw something we didn't. Joey noticed too, nudging me when Mark lagged behind, staring at the pond's distant shimmer. "He okay?" Joey whispered. I shrugged, but my skin prickled. That night, as we ate by the fire, Mark barely spoke, his fork scraping the pot with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. When I woke to that cold, the tent wasn't just empty, it was wrong. The air smelled of rot, faint but unmistakable, like something had crawled inside and left its breath behind. Mark's jacket wasn't just crumpled, it was twisted, like he'd fought it off. The open flap didn't sway, it hung, deliberate, an invitation to the dark, searching for him. The forest changed. The pines weren't just tall, they were sentinels, their branches knitting a cage above us. The ground wasn't just uneven, it pulsed, soft and warm, like we walked on flesh. Every sound, our boots, our shouts, felt stolen, swallowed by a silence that pressed against my eardrums. Joey's bravado cracked first, his flashlight jerking at shadows, his voice sharp with panic. "He's fine, right? He's got to be fine." I wanted to believe him, but the cap, the socks, the clothes, they weren't accidents. They were a trail, laid out like bait. Finding the body broke us. It wasn't just Mark's absence, it was the precision. The cut was too clean, surgical, like the forest had a scalpel. The blood didn't pool, it spread, deliberate, like ink from a quill. Joey's denial wasn't just grief, it was survival, his mind rejecting a truth too vast to hold. I didn't cry, not then. I shut down, my thoughts a loop. This isn't real, this can't be real. But the smell was real, copper and decay, thick enough to choke. Running back, the forest fought us. Roots rose where they hadn't been, tripping us. Branches snapped too close, grazing our necks. My flashlight didn't flicker, it dimmed, like the dark was drinking it. Joey's sobs were a beacon, the only thing keeping me grounded. The car felt like a betrayal, its engine roaring too loud, too human. As we fled to the rangers, the aftermath was a different horror. The rangers' eyes weren't just skeptical, they were knowing, like they'd seen this before. The cops didn't just question us, they dissected us, their words carving out pieces of our story to fit their narrative. The precinct wasn't just cold, it was a tomb, the interrogation room's walls closing in, the mirror reflecting a stranger's face. Mine, but hollow. Life after was no life at all. Joey's move to Oregon wasn't escape, it was exile, his letters brief, his voice distant on rare calls. I stayed, but Cambridge wasn't home. It was a stage, every street a reminder of Mark's laugh, now silenced. Jobs slipped through my fingers, my focus shattered by flashes of that clearing. Friends drifted, unable to bridge the gap to the ghost I'd become. My girlfriend tried, her patience a lifeline, but I couldn't let her in. The nightmares were mine alone. Mark walking away, stripping, his headless shadow turning to beckon me. Therapy helped, but it was like bandaging a severed limb. Meds dulled the panic, but the forest lived in me, its roots coiled around my thoughts. Writing it down was my last defense, a way to trap it on paper, but the words grew claws, scratching new wounds. I don't camp, don't hike, don't trust trees. A park bench is too close to the wild, a backyard shadow too alive. The whispers came later, from dive bars and gas stations, from locals who spoke in low tones. A figure in the pines, too tall, its face a hole. Deer skulls arranged in spirals, their antlers pointing north. Footprints that vanished mid-stride. The old-timer's story about the pond's red eyes wasn't just a tale. It was a warning, his trembling hands proof of its weight. I hunted for more, scouring archives, forums, anything. A 1963 Rangers log. Headless remains, no name, no closure. A 1940s clipping. Loggers gone, their axes left in a circle. A 1920s diary, found in an attic. A trapper's scrawl about the thing that hunts heads. His last entry smeared with blood. The map was the key, or the lock. Mark had it, his fingers brushing its creases as we planned. It wasn't in his genes, wasn't in the evidence. I checked, called, begged the precinct. Nothing. I see it now, in dreams. A hand, not human, clutching it. Its nails tracing our path, circling Berry Pond. The forest doesn't forget. It marks its prey, patient, eternal. I drove by once, years later, to prove I could. The Harold Parker sign stood like a gravestone, its letters faded but sharp. The trees leaned in, their shadows whispering, "You're ours." My heart hammered, my hands iron on the wheel. I didn't stop, didn't breathe until the city's glow drowned the green. But the forest follows me. In every silence, I hear the ponds lapping, feel the cold, see the stump. And I know it's not done. It's waiting. Its hunger as old as the pines, as deep as the dark. That's the chilling tale of Mark, lost to the shadows of Harold Parker State Forest back in 1979. A reminder that sometimes the wilderness doesn't just take your peace, it takes your head, literally. If that story made your skin crawl, smash that subscribe button and join the No Sleep Nightmares Reddit crew. We've got more twisted tales coming your way. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's next. Drop a comment below. What do you think snagged Mark's noggin? A psycho with a machete, or something that doesn't bleed like we do? Let's hear your theories. I read every one, even the ones that make me sleep with the lights on. Now, let's shift gears and head south, where the air's thick and the woods don't play nice. Picture this. Tennessee, 2003. 3 buddies looking for a buzz under the stars, thinking a quick camping trip will shake off their dead-end lives. But when morning comes, they don't find peace. They find something skinned, stretched, and waiting on a truck hood like a sick welcome mat. This isn't your average campfire scare, folks. Buckle up for a story where the forest doesn't whisper warnings. It leaves them in blood. Tennessee in late summer is a beast. Humid, relentless. A furnace that melts your skin right off your bones. The air's a swamp of dust and diesel, so thick you could chew it. And in 2003, it was strangling me, Craig, and Tanner. We were 25, rotting in Dunlap, a nowhere speck on the map where ambition went to die. Craig was the dreamer, a lanky mechanic with hands stained black from grease and eyes that stared past the horizon, chasing a life he'd never snag. Tanner, short and scrappy, was the cynic, a bartender who slung beers and barbs with surgical precision, his smirk a mask for a temper that flared like a match. Me, I was the glue, a delivery driver with a '92 Ford pickup that coughed like a smoker and a talent for keeping the peace, drifting through days until something, anything, shook me awake. We were restless, caged by jobs that barely kept the fridge stocked with Coors. And when Craig pitched a camping trip to the backwoods, it was our middle finger to the grind, a cheap, reckless escape. The plan was bare bones. One night, no fuss, just us, a tent, and the wild. We picked a spot deep in Sequatchie County, where the Cumberland Plateau's ridges stabbed the sky and dirt roads twist into oblivion. It was a place where cell phones flatlined and the stars blazed raw, untainted by Dunlap's sodium glow. We weren't woodsmen. Craig couldn't light a fire without swearing. Tanner thought fishing was for chumps. But we'd camped enough as kids to fake it. My truck, dented and wheezing, would haul us. Craig dug up a tent from his cousin's attic, its canvas patched with duct tape. Tanner brought a cooler, chipped and leaking, and I tossed in a hatchet, rope and a propane stove running on fumes. We packed light, a 12-pack, hot dogs, a bag of stale chips, and a deck of cards. Survival wasn't the point. Getting blitzed under the open sky was. The drive out was electric. Friday afternoon, the sun a lazy smear bleeding across the sky. We peeled out of Dunlap with Lynyrd Skynyrd blasting, the truck's speakers buzzing like a swarm of pissed-off wasps. Craig rode shotgun, feet propped on the dash, cracking dumbass jokes about Bigfoot raiding our stash. Tanner sprawled in the back, flipping through a dog-eared Playboy, hollering at us to crank the volume. I grinned, the wheels shaking under my palms, each mile unwinding the knot in my chest. By late afternoon, asphalt turned to gravel, then dirt, the truck jolting over ruts as the forest swallowed us. Pines towered, their needles carpeting the ground, and the air sharpened, swapping exhaust for earth and sap. We found a clearing a mile off the trail, ringed by gnarled oaks and a creek that gurgled like it was whispering secrets. It was raw, quiet, ours. A slice of nowhere that felt like everywhere. We set up quick. Craig wrestled the tent, cursing its bent poles like they'd personally wronged him. While Tanner and I hacked at branches, the hatchet's thwack ringing out like gunfire. By dusk, the fire crackled, its orange glow clawing back the shadows. Hot dogs sizzled on sticks, grease popping, the scent tangling with pine and smoke. Beers sweated in our hands, cold enough to sting, and we laughed over nothing. Craig's shitty aim with a bottle cap, Tanner's tale of a bar fight he swore he won. He didn't. The woods were hushed, just the fire's snap and the creek's low hum. And for once, life clicked. I leaned back, the log's bark digging into my spine, and thought, this is it. This is enough. Night crashed down hard, the stars a wild scatter overhead. We drank too much, played cards by firelight, and bickered over who'd win in a brawl, Chuck Norris or a grizzly. Tanner conked out first, snoring in the tent, boots still laced. Craig followed, slurring about constellations he couldn't name. I stayed up, poking the fire, the coals glowing like embers of something alive. The woods weren't still, they watched, a presence lurking beyond the light, sizing us up. I crawled in around midnight, the ground icy through my sleeping bag, and drifted off to Tanner's wheeze and the fire's last gasps. Morning dawned grey, the sky a bruised slab pressing down. The fire was ash, its heat a memory. Craig and Tanner were still out, their sleeping bags lumpy heaps. I stretched, joints cracking like gunfire, and figured coffee was my only shot at outrunning the hangover clawing my brain. The truck sat 10 yards off, its blue paint dulled by dust. I shuffled over, gravel crunching under my boots, and reached for the tailgate to grab the pot. Then I saw it. A skin, animal, raw, wrong, lay stretched across the hood, flat and deliberate, like a sick artist's canvas. It wasn't flung there. It was placed, every inch smoothed with intent. The fur was gone, scraped off, leaving a pinkish underside that glistened wet, streaked with blood. The blood wasn't fresh. It was thick, dark, clotting at the edges, smearing down the windshield like a sloppy signature. No head, no legs, just a torso, the cuts jagged, hacked with something dull and cruel. The smell slammed me next. Sour, meaty, like roadkill baked under a July sun. So dense it coated my tongue and stung my eyes. I froze, hand hovering, coffee a distant dream. My pulse thudded, a dull drum in my ears. I scanned the trees, half expecting eyes, but the woods were dead still. No birds, no wind, just a silence that squeezed my throat like a fist. I stumbled back, boots scuffing dirt, and kicked the tent. Craig, Tanner, get your asses out here. They lurched out, groggy, swearing. Craig rubbed his eyes, grumbling. What's your damn deal, man? Then he saw it, and his jaw hit the dirt. Tanner froze mid-yawn, smirk vanishing, face bleaching white like he'd seen death itself. The skin lay there, accusing, its edges curling as it dried in the damp air. We didn't speak. Words weren't needed. Something was wrong. A bone-deep wrongness that sank into us like cold mud. What the hell is that? Craig whispered, edging closer, then halting like the truck might bite. Deer, maybe, Tanner croaked, voice tight. Or something. No head, I said, mouth dry as ash. No legs. Who does that? We circled the truck, keeping our distance, like the skin might spring up and grab us. Up close, it was a nightmare. The cuts weren't clean. They were savage, torn, like whatever did it savored the mess. The blood had pooled in the hood's dents, congealing into a sticky jelly that shimmered black. The smell was a gut punch, rancid and relentless, worming into my nose and staying there. I swept the clearing with my eyes, tent, fire pit, creek, but nothing stirred. No tracks, no drag marks, just our boot prints from last night, mocking us. My skin prickled like ants swarmed beneath it, and my breath hitched, shallow and sharp. We gotta get out of here, Tanner said, already snatching the cooler, his hands shaking. Hold up, Craig said, squinting at the skin, his voice wobbling. Someone's screwing with us. Kids maybe. Rednecks. Kids don't skin shit like that, I snapped, my voice cracking. And rednecks don't sneak in silent. We tore down camp, no folding, no care, just hurling gear into the truck's bed. I grabbed a stick, long and splintered, and poked the skin. It slid off with a wet slap, hitting the dirt like a slab of meat, the sound echoing in the stillness. I didn't look at it again, couldn't risk seeing what might stare back. We piled in, me at the wheel, Craig's shotgun, Tanner in the back, clutching the cooler like a lifeline. I floored it, tires spitting dust, the forest blurring into a green smear. The rear view stayed empty, but I checked it every heartbeat, waiting for a shape, a face, something. The silence chased us, heavy and alive, pressing against the windows. The drive back was a funeral march, the radio dead. Skynerd's rebel yell silenced. Craig stared out the window, fingers drumming a jittery beat on his knee. Tanner shredded his cuticles, knee bouncing like a piston, his breath ragged. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white, trying to blank my mind, but the skin kept flashing, its pink sheen, its blood, its care. We hit Dunlap by noon, splitting fast, no goodbyes, just a nod and gone. I drove home, parked, and grabbed the hose. The blood washed off in red swirls, pooling in the driveway like a crime scene. But the hood felt tainted, like the truck remembered every drop. That night, I couldn't shake it. The skin wasn't a prank. It was a message, etched in flesh and blood. I hit the gas station, cornered old man Harris, the grizzled bastard who knew every whisper in Sequatchie. His eyes narrowed when I spilled it, his cigarette trembling between yellowed fingers. Heard that before, he rasped, voice low, smoke curling. Skinned animals, left on cars, porches, deep in the woods. Been happening since I was a kid. Ain't no kids doing it neither. It's a warning. You stepped where you don't belong. What's it mean? I asked, throat tight, tasting bile. He shrugged, exhaling a grey cloud. Means leave. Don't go back. Sleep didn't come. I sat on my couch, lights blazing, picturing the skin, its careful spread, its missing pieces, the way it fit the hood like a glove. I hit the internet, digging through forums, old papers, anything. Stories stacked up like bones. A hunter in '89 finding a skinned fox on his Jeep, head gone. A camper in '76, waking to a rabbit's pelt on her tent, legs hacked off. A farmer in '62 swearing a cow's hide was nailed to his barn, no tracks around, always remote, always night, always headless. Some blame feral cults, others muttered about the old things, spirits tied to the land, pissed at trespassers. One post froze my blood. A guy in '98 saw shapes in the trees after finding a skin, heard whispers at his window for weeks. He moved. The noises followed. I told myself it was bullshit. Sickos with too much time, maybe. But the woods hadn't felt right that night. The silence wasn't empty. It was packed, like something held its breath, waiting to pounce. I checked the locks, kept a knife by my bed, but my eyes stayed open, darting to shadows. The skin was a brand, seared into my skull, and the truck's hood was its altar. Craig called the next day, voice shaky, like he'd aged a decade. You think it was random? No, I said flat. You? A pause, too long. I heard something last night, outside my window, like scratching. Tanner wouldn't talk, just texted, I'm fine, drop it. But his eyes at the bar later were hollow, his hands trembling, pouring shots, spilling whiskey like blood. We didn't camp again, didn't speak of it, but it clung to us, a shadow no beer could wash away. I still drive the truck, but every glance at the hood drags it back. The pink, the blood, the care. I lock my doors, check my windows, listen for scratches in the dark. The woods are out there, waiting, and whatever left that skin knows my name. Dunlap wasn't just a town, it was a prison, its streets a grid of rust and regret. Craig, Tanner and I weren't buddies by choice. We were survivors, forged in the kiln of shared stagnation. Craig was the spark, always sketching blueprints for a garage he'd never build, his laugh a flare against the gloom. Tanner was the storm, quick to bite, his wit a blade that cut both ways, his bravado hiding a brittleness I'd seen crack before. I was the steady one, the guy who kept us from killing each other. My life a slow drift in a truck that rattled like my thoughts. Together, we were a shaky tripod, leaning but upright, until the woods kicked us over. The clearing wasn't just a spot, it was a lure. The creek's gurgle wasn't soothing, it was deliberate, a rhythm too steady, like a heartbeat under the dirt. The oaks didn't just ring us, they caged us, their branches weaving a net that dimmed the stars to pinpricks. Setting up, I caught flickers I ignored then. The fire's light bending away from the creek, like it feared the water. A stone Craig tripped over, too smooth, etched with lines that might have been letters if you squinted. Tanner swore he saw a deer vanish mid-stride, its shape swallowed by the trees. But we laughed. Booze and bullshit. Nothing more. That night, the fire didn't warm us. It judged us. The flames flickered wrong, stretching shadows too long, too thin, like fingers reaching for the dark. Tanner's jabs turned sharp, Craig's stories faltered, and I felt it, a pressure, like eyes drilling into my back. The woods weren't quiet. They hummed, a low throb I felt in my bones, not my ears. I stayed up, stirring the coals, and heard a snap. Not a branch, but something heavier, like a rib cracking. I told myself it was nothing, but my hand shook, the stick trembling in the ash. Waking to the skin was waking to a trap sprung. The grey sky wasn't just overcast, it was a shroud, sealing us in. The truck wasn't parked, it was marked, its hood a stage for the skin's debut. Up close, it was grotesque. The pink wasn't even, it mottled, like rot creeping under flesh. The blood didn't drip, it flowed, tracing the hood's curves like a map. The smell wasn't just decay, it was layered, sweet and sick, like flowers wilting in a grave. My stomach heaved, but I couldn't turn away. The skin wasn't an animal, it was a claim, a flag planted in our world, tearing down camp. The woods resisted. The tense stakes clung to the ground, like roots gripped them. The creek's hum spiked, mocking us, and a branch snapped too near, though the air stayed still. Craig's hands fumbled the tarp. Tanner's eyes darted like a cornered dog's, and I felt it. Eyes, not human, boring into my spine. The truck's roar was an insult, too loud, too alive, and as we fled, the trees seemed to lean, their shadows clawing the dirt, reluctant to let go. Back in Dunlap, the skin didn't leave us. It infected us. Craig's dreams went black, his sketches now jagged shapes with hollow eyes. Tanner drank harder, his smirks gone, his hands twitching at every creak. I saw it everywhere, the pink in my coffee steam, the blood in a sunset's glow, the smell in every gust. Harris's warning wasn't just a story, it was a thread, pulling me into older horrors. A 70s ranger's log mentioned offerings, pelts left on trails, no culprits caught. A 50s diary, buried in a library, described a trapper finding skins circling his camp, hearing laughter that echoed inside his skull. A Cherokee tale, half erased, spoke of the flayed ones, spirits who marked their turf with flesh, claiming souls who lingered. The truck was cursed. I scrubbed it, hands raw, but the hood stayed cold, like it knew. Driving, I'd hear it, a scrape, faint, beneath the engine's growl. At night, my windows rattled, no wind to blame. Craig heard it too, scratches, then whispers, too soft to catch. Tanner bolted, left no trace, but his last call was a slur of panic. It's still here. I don't camp, don't hike, don't trust the open. The woods are alive, their hunger ancient as the ridges, and the skin was just the beginning. The days after stretched thin, like a rope fraying under strain. Dunlap streets felt narrower, the air heavier, like the town itself was complicit. Craig stopped sketching, his hands idle, his laugh a ghost. Tanner quit the bar, left his apron on the counter, and vanished. Rumors said he'd hitched to Nashville, but no one knew. I kept driving, delivering packages with a blank stare, but the truck's hum was a taunt, its hood a mirror reflecting that pink nightmare every time I parked. Sleep was a battlefield. I'd lie there, lights on, knife in hand, listening. The first night, it was just the house settling, creaks, groans, normal shit. By the third, it was sharper, scratches, like nails on glass, faint but deliberate. I'd check the windows, find nothing, but the sound followed me back to bed, burrowing into my skull. One night, I swore I heard breathing, slow, wet, right outside my room. I yanked the curtains, saw only dark, but the air felt thick, like something had just slipped away. I dug deeper, desperate for sense. Old-timers at the diner swapped tales over coffee. A logger in '85, finding a skinned coon on his chainsaw, quitting the next day. A preacher in '67, preaching about marks of the profane. Pelts left on his porch after a sermon on sin. Online, the stories grew teeth. A hiker in '94 snapping pics of a skin on a rock, his camera later showing shadows that weren't there. A trucker in '81 hearing scratches on his rig after finding a pelt, crashing a week later, babbling about eyes in the trees. The Cherokee law stuck hardest. The flayed ones, born from a hunter who skinned his kin, cursed to roam, marking intruders with their own craft. Headless, they said, because they'd lost their own. The truck wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a beacon. I'd park it, hear the scrape, feel the cold seep from the hood even in August's heat. One night, I caught it, a shadow too tall, flickering at the lot's edge. I blinked, and it was gone, but my pulse didn't lie. Craig called again, voice a whisper. It's under my floor now, scratching up. I drove to his place, found it empty, his sketches scattered, crude, eyeless figures circling a truck. Tanner's phone was dead, his apartment vacant, a neighbor saying he'd screamed about hands before running. I burned the tent, ditched the cooler, but the truck stayed. I couldn't afford another. Every drive, I'd hear it. Scratches, whispers, a hum like the creaks. The hood gleamed wrong, too clean, like it wanted the next skin. Last week, I found a scratch on my door. Not a mark, a word. Mine. I don't sleep now, just wait, knife in hand, listening. The woods are patient, their hunger endless, and I'm next on the list, and there you have it. The Tennessee backwoods serving up a skin surprise that'd make even the toughest redneck rethink his weekend plans. Who needs a horror movie when the trees are dropping flesh bombs on your ride? If that one's got you checking your locks tonight, hit that subscribe button and join the No Sleep Nightmares Reddit family. We're just getting started, and the nightmares don't stop here. Leave a comment. What do you reckon left that skin? A hillbilly with a skinning knife, or something older that doesn't need a blade to peel you apart. I want to know what's haunting your thoughts. I'm nosy like that. Next up, we're crossing the border and heading north, where the wild's got a different flavour. Ontario, 1997. Two hardcore campers, Chris and his reluctant sidekick, think they've got Algonquin Provincial Park figured out. 7 days of roughing it, living off the land, no safety net. Sounds gritty, right? Until they stumble on a church that shouldn't exist. Old, chained, and hiding something under a trapdoor that turns their adventure into a descent they can't unsee. This isn't about cozy campfires anymore, folks. It's about what lurks where no one's supposed to look. Ontario's summers are a paradox. Hot enough to boil your blood, yet shadowed by forests so dense they swallow the sun whole. In 1997, that paradox was my lifeline. Chris and I were 24, Toronto natives tethered by a friendship forged in the ravines of our childhood, where we ditch class to chase frogs and dodge cops. Chris was the firecracker, tall, wiry, with a grin that could talk us out of anything, and a restless streak that burned through every job he'd ever had. Me, I was the anchor, shorter, quieter, a desk jockey who'd rather watch the chaos than start it. My life a beige blur of spreadsheets and coffee stains. We'd turned our love for the outdoors into a ritual. Summer camping trips, each one a little wilder, a little riskier. We called it hardcore camping. No tents, no stoves, just ponchos, ground sheets, and whatever we could hump on our backs. Food was scarce, forcing us to forage and fish, and that raw edge was the point. That year, we chose Algonquin Provincial Park, a 7,600 square kilometre beast of pine, birch and lakes. 7 days of wilderness to test our guts and forget the city's chokehold. We started strong. Day one, we hiked 12 miles from the trailhead, cutting through thickets of pine and birch that clawed at our packs. The air was cool, laced with sap and damp earth. The sky patchy with clouds like spilled paint. My calves burned, but Chris strode ahead, his long legs eating the ground, his whoops echoing off the trees. We set up near a shallow creek, its water chattering over stones like a nervous laugh. I rigged my poncho over a branch, the plastic snapping in the breeze, while Chris scavenged sticks, his fire sparking to life with a smug crackle. We ate jerky, boiled creek water in a tin cup, and watched the flames die as stars pierced the dark. The woods were quiet, just leaves rustling and an owl's distant hoot. But it was our kind of quiet, pure and unspoiled. Day two hit harder. The terrain turned brutal, rocks jutting like broken teeth, roots snaking underfoot, and we climbed a ridge that left my legs screaming. Chris outpaced me, his lanky frame a blur ahead, tossing back taunts about my city legs. That night, we slept on a mossy flat, the ground cold as a corpse, seeping through my ground sheet. I woke once to a twig snapping, my hand fumbling for the knife at my side, but it was just a deer, its eyes glinting before it melted into the dark. By day three, we'd found our rhythm, packs lighter, food dwindling, hunger sharpening our instincts. Chris hooked a trout in a stream, using a line he'd rigged from twine and a bent hook, and we cooked it over a fire, splitting the flaky meat with grubby fingers. The water we drank was fast-moving, cold enough to ache, better than any bottled crap back home. We checked the map occasionally, but mostly we moved by feel, letting the forest guide us through its maze of green. Day 4 started routine. Chris was up first, rolling his ground sheet, while I crawled out, blinking at the grey dawn. We ate the last granola, shouldered our packs, and headed north, boots thudding on pine needles. The forest was thick, swallowing sound, our steps the only pulse. Around noon, we stopped at a narrow stream to refill canteens, the water icy against my face as I splashed it on. Chris tapped my shoulder, voice low. "You see that?" He pointed, and I squinted. At first, nothing, just trees and underbrush. But then it emerged. A shape, too straight, too deliberate to be natural. We grabbed our packs and pushed closer, branches snagging our clothes. The trees parted, and there it was, a church, or what passed for one. Its walls were old wood, grey and cracked, like it had stood a century or more, the grain splintered and moss-eaten. The roof sloped steep, blanketed in needles and green fuzz, a rusted cross teetering at the peak. Another cross dangled from the front door, boarded shut and chained with a padlock thick with rust. No steeple, no windows, just a weathered box, half swallowed by the forest, its edges blurring into the pines. I turned to Chris, half laughing. "What the hell's this doing out here?" He didn't answer, just pulled the map, spreading it on the dirt. His finger traced our route. Nothing. No mark, no symbol, no hint of anything man-made for miles. "No roads," I said, peering over his shoulder. "No paths. How's it even here?" Chris's eyes locked on the building, a glint sparking in them. "Let's check it out." We circled it, stepping over roots, ducking limbs. The chain door was a rust-caked relic, the padlock untouched, like it had been sealed forever. The air around it was stale, heavy with rot and something sharper, metal maybe, or old blood. On the side, a hole gaped where the wood had rotted away, low and jagged, just big enough to crawl through. "Animal den," Chris said, peering in, but his voice wavered. He shrugged off his pack, dropped to his knees and grinned. "You coming or what?" "You're nuts," I said, my gut twisting. "Just shine a light in. We don't need to go inside." He ignored me, belly crawling through, the hole's edges scraping his jacket. I couldn't let him go alone, stupid loyalty, so I ditched my pack and followed, the wood clawing my shoulders, dirt smearing my face. Inside, the air was damp, cold, a tomb's breath, thick with mildew and dust. We stood, brushing off, the dim light filtering through the hole barely touching the walls. The place was empty, no pews, no altar, just bare planks and a floor of packed earth littered with dry leaves that crunched like bones underfoot. At the far end, a huge wooden cross loomed, its surface pitted and dark, like it had soaked up something foul. But the real kicker was the center, a steel trapdoor, half buried in dirt, its edges bolted, wrapped in chains, a rusted padlock gleaming dully through the grime. I stepped closer, staring. The trapdoor was solid, no scratches, no marks, just cold, filthy metal, unyielding as a vault. Chris knelt beside it, tugging the chains. They rattled, heavy and taut. "What's worth chaining like this?" I muttered, half to myself. "Maybe it's not a church anymore," Chris said, looking up, his eyes too bright. "Could be a hideout, smuggler stash, cash, loot, locked up and forgotten." I shook my head. "Or something worse. Chemicals, waste, shit people don't want found." He smirked, standing, wiping his hands. "We gotta get in there, man. This is it, the adventure." "Chris, slow down," I said, grabbing his arm. "If it's cash, it's someone's. Stealing from that kind of someone gets you a shallow grave." He yanked free, already heading for the hole. "Let's find something to break it. Rock, branch, whatever." I yelled after him, but he was gone, crawling out. I scrambled after, the hole's edges biting harder this time. Outside, he paced, kicking the ground, searching. "What are you doing?" I snapped, knowing the answer. Looking for a rock, he said, not looking up. Something heavy enough to smash that lock. The forest floor was useless. Needles, twigs, nothing big. This is dumb, I said, voice rising. Even if you're right, it's not worth it. Gang stash, cult shit. Whoever owns it doesn't mess around. He didn't hear me, or didn't care. I'd never seen him like this. His usual spark twisted into something manic, his eyes darting like a predator's. I'll hike till I find something, he shouted, striding into the trees. I don't care how long, I snapped, lunging, grabbing his shoulder, spinning him around. What the hell's wrong with you? He shoved me, hard, and we grappled, his height against my bulk. He was stronger than I'd guessed, but I was pissed, shoving him against a pine, bark flaking off. Stop, just effing stop. He froze, hands dropping, and blinked, like waking up. I stumbled back, panting. What's gotten into you, man? I don't know, he said, pale, sweaty, rubbing his temples. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The trapdoor. What's down there? I need to know. You good? I crouched beside him, adrenaline fading. He nodded, slow. Yeah, let's move. We grabbed our packs, left the church behind, but the trip was off after that. 2 more nights, we stuck to routine. Hiking, foraging, boiling water. But the spark was dead. I watched Chris, waiting for that wild edge to flare again. But he stayed quiet, normal, like it had never happened. By the time we hiked out and drove back to Toronto, he was joking again, calling the church the cellar stash. A punchline over beers. I played along, but alone, it wasn't funny. That trapdoor stuck with me, its chains glinting in my head, a riddle I couldn't shake. Back home, life slid to normal. Me at my desk, Chris in kitchens, planning our next trip over drinks. We laughed about the church, but never went back to Algonquin. I couldn't let it go though. Nights, I'd lie awake, picturing it. The grey wood, the rusted crosses, the trapdoor sealed tight. Chris's cash and jewels theory felt thin. Something about the place screamed wrong, darker than a crook's stash. His manic glint that day, was it him, or something in the church? I scoured forums, found nothing, no records, no stories, like it didn't exist. Maybe it didn't, not officially. Maybe someone built it out there far from everything, for a reason we'd never know. Years passed, Chris stayed solid, but I didn't. I'd dream of the trapdoor, hear the chains rattle, feel that stale air. We dodged Algonquin, stuck to safer trips, an unspoken pact. I never told him how it haunted me, how I wondered if we'd brushed something worse than we knew. The church is still there, I'm sure, rotting among the pines, and whatever's under that trapdoor, I hope it stays chained. Toronto in '97 was a pressure cooker. Humid, grey, a city that pressed you flat if you let it. Chris and I were its escape artists, our hardcore camping a rebellion against cubicles and concrete. Chris was the wild card, a lanky tornado who'd bounced from cook to courier, his grin a weapon, his energy a drug. I was the shadow, steady, cautious, my office job a slow bleed, my calm a counterweight to his chaos. Algonquin was our crucible that year, a beast we'd tame with grit and luck, or so we thought. The first days were a grind, but alive. The forest smelled of pine and wet stone, its air cool against the sweat on my neck. Chris's strides were a taunt, his voice bouncing off trees, while I lagged, boots sinking into moss, lungs burning. The creek camp was raw, water chattering, fire spitting, stars glaring down like judges. Day two's ridge was a bastard, rocks slicing my shins, roots tripping me. But Chris laughed it off, his silhouette a dare against the sky. The moss bed was ice, the deer's snap a jolt, but it was ours, wild, unscripted. By day 3, hunger was our engine. Chris's trout was a triumph, its flesh hot and sweet, the stream's water a shock to my teeth. The forest felt like a partner then, guiding us, its silence a gift. But day 4 cracked that illusion. The church wasn't just a find, it was a rupture. Its wood wasn't grey, it was dead, bleached by time, splintered like it had been clawed apart. The roof's moss wasn't green, it was sickly, a fungal shroud. The cross atop it bent like a broken spine. The air wasn't stale. It was wrong, thick with rot, and a metallic tang that stung my nose clung to my throat. Inside, the emptiness wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. The leaves didn't crunch. They snapped, sharp as breaking glass, echoing in the gloom. The cross wasn't just old. It loomed, its shadow a weight, its grain stained with something I couldn't name. The trapdoor wasn't steel. It was a void, its surface swallowing light. The chains not rusted but coated, like they'd bled rust into the dirt. Chris's tug wasn't curious. It was desperate, his fingers white-knuckled, his breath quick. His eyes didn't glint. They burned, a fever I'd never seen. And his words weren't playful. They were a command. When he bolted outside, it wasn't adventure. It was possession. The forest turned then, its quiet a growl. The pines not trees but watchers, their needles hissing as he paced. Our fight wasn't just a scuffle. It was a breaking point. His shove a jolt, my pin a plea. His snap back to normal wasn't relief. It was a mask, his calm too sudden, too thin. The rest of the trip wasn't off. It was tainted. Every step heavy, every shadow too long. The forest didn't guide us anymore. It hunted, its air thick, its sounds muted but alive, like a predator pacing us out. Toronto didn't erase it. Chris laughed it off, but his jokes were hollow, his eyes dodging mine when the church came up. I couldn't laugh, couldn't sleep. The trapdoor wasn't a mystery, it was a call. Its chains rattling in my dreams, the air choking me awake. I dug, found scraps, an 1890s log about a prayer house lost to fire, a 60s hiker's tale of a chained door, voices below. No proof, but patterns. Vanishings near that latitude, whispers of a cult that sealed the sin. Chris moved on, or pretended to, but I didn't. The church wasn't a ruin, it was a cage, and whatever's beneath waits, patient, eternal. And there you have it, folks. 3 slices of nightmare fuel straight from the wild, where the trees don't just watch, they wait. From Mark's Headless exit in Harold Parker, where the forest played guillotine with a grin, to that skin surprise in Tennessee, turning a truck hood into a butcher's billboard, and finally that chained-up church in Algonquin, whispering secrets no sane soul should hear. These stories prove one thing. Nature's not your friend. It's a predator with a sick sense of humor, and we're the punchline. Whether it's a missing head, a flayed warning, or a trapdoor that calls your name, the wilderness has a way of reminding us who's really in charge. Spoiler, it's not us. If these tales kept you up, staring at your ceiling, wondering what's scratching outside, or if you're just twisted enough to love this stuff, smash that subscribe button and join the No Sleep Nightmares Reddit crew. We've got more shadows to drag into the light, and trust me, they're uglier than your ex's new haircut. Drop a comment below. Which story hit you hardest? Mark's bloody stump, Tennessee's skin job, or that church's creepy lockbox? Or maybe you've got your own tale, something that crawled out of the woods and won't let go. Share it. I read every one, even the ones that make me triple check my doors. Thanks for diving into the dark with us. Sleep tight, or don't. The wild's still out there, patient as ever, and it's got plenty more to show us. See you in the next nightmare, where the campfire's cold and the shadows bite back.